Hi, my name is Ashley Quick and I'm with the Project Success Resource Center. Thanks for joining me today on our webinar regarding instructional strategies for students with significant disabilities. Before we get started today, I want to remind you about all the resource centers that are available through the Indiana Resource Network. Project Success is just one of those resource centers focusing on supporting the needs of students with more significant disabilities, but there are several other resource centers that we work in conjunction with who also provide excellent services and supports for students with disabilities. I recommend you check out the list on the Indiana Department of Education website. You can just type in their search bar IRN to get the Indiana Resource Network, and you'll see a list of a description of all the resource centers and what they do. And to access any of Project Success resources, our website is projectsuccessindiana.com. And you'll just click on the upper right-hand corner where it says resources, and you'll find all the different resources, links to other webinars we've done, lesson plan templates, and so much more. Feel free to check that out. For today, here's what we'll be discussing. First, I want to talk a little bit about accessing general education curriculum and how that is the basis for good instructional strategies for students with significant needs. Then we'll specifically get into both reading strategies and written expression strategies. We won't be able to cover everything today as far as instructional strategies go, but this should give you a good basis to get started on trying some new things when we're talking about instruction for students with significant needs. I wanted to point out that that book on the right side of the screen is the book where a lot of this information comes from. And there's a link there as well that you can click on the link to be able to get more information about the book and hear further details about what we talk about today. So as a starting point, let's look at how promoting access to general education aligns with all the goals of the Indiana Department of Education and more broadly under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, in providing equity and access to students with disabilities. We're really ultimately trying to get improved outcomes for these students, and the way that we're doing that is by focusing on equity and access. Part of that access includes students being able to access their general education curriculum. Whether that's in an inclusive setting or in a self-contained setting, students have the right to access that content. So we'll talk about how we can make that accessible through the use of these strategies. Of course, the first way students with disabilities, significant disabilities, are able to access content is through Indiana's content connectors. Those are the alternate standards in Indiana that are condensed versions of the Indiana academic standards. They're not meant to be easier, rather a narrowed down version of the Indiana academic standards that really focuses on and keys in on the highlights that students need to know in order to make progress in the curriculum. All content connectors are important for instruction. Not all content connectors will appear on the assessment. This is a brief overview talking about who these content connectors are for, what they are. They are for students with significant intellectual disabilities. We want to make sure that we are having high expectations for all students. So if there's a student that does not have a significant intellectual disability, they should still be working on mastery of the Indiana academic standards. The content connectors show up all over the place in lesson planning, instruction, which is what we'll primarily talk about today, but as well as IEP goals and then of course on the IEM assessment. Regardless, the use of content connectors should be in the least restrictive environment, and that asterisk there really implies or is meant to point out that the least restrictive environment isn't a physical location necessarily. It's wherever the student can best progress in the curriculum that they're working on at that time and still have as much access as possible to what their non-disabled peers have access to. Why do we have content connectors? Of course, it goes along with that the whole idea of higher expectations for our students. And then how? One way that we can provide access to those content connectors is through the use of these instructional strategies we'll talk about today. For more information on the content connectors, you can click on that link in the upper right-hand corner for a webinar that we've done in the past that's just a simple guide to content connectors. When we're thinking about the use of content connectors, they can be used both in the gen ed setting and a self-contained setting, or any combination thereof. And when we're thinking about the content that's within those content connectors, we want to make sure that we're focusing on both students being able to master skills and content that are at their level or near their level, but also being exposed to what their non-disabled grade level peers are being exposed to. So this graphic just shows you that we really sort of zero in on and hone in on that center of mastering skills at the student's ability level, but then also work on exposing students to the grade level content around them as well. And again, this idea is for students with the most significant needs. So let's take a look now at how access to the curriculum plays a part in this idea of exposure versus mastery. We start off from the assumption that students will be participating in the general education curriculum, and then we can go through this series of questions here to determine whether that's appropriate for an individual student. First, we want to consider whether supplementary aids and services have been implemented and tried. If yes, that has been done and that has been effective, then the student can still maintain the general curriculum for their formal curriculum. If the supplementary aids and services aren't quite getting the job done, then we start looking at, can we adapt the curriculum? Are there adaptations that are necessary that then may be sufficient to making the student have access to the general education curriculum? If that's not sufficient, then we look at augmenting the curriculum, and we'll talk about what all these terms mean in here in just a minute. If that's sufficient, then the student can still maintain the general ed curriculum as their formal curriculum. It's only when we get down to the bottom of that list where we have tried supplementary aids and services, we've tried adapting the curriculum, and we've tried augmenting the curriculum, then we'll consider an alternate curriculum for students with significant needs. Let's look at it a little more simply. So step one is looking at the supplementary aids and services. This would include your assistive technology. So there's sort of a set of steps that you can go through to determine what might be appropriate aids and services for a student. You're going to think about organizing all the information that you have about the student, their strengths, their needs. Then you'll also look at compiling the information about the general education classroom where they may be able to participate in receiving this gen ed content. Once you've compiled all that information about the student and the classroom, then you're going to start looking at identifying potential barriers to the curriculum or to the instruction that's going on in that classroom, in that gen ed environment. Finally, you'll look at identifying the supplementary aids and services that would most appropriately eliminate those barriers that you've identified. And once you've identified those services and supports, then you create an action plan to really get it put into place. There are several different categories of supplementary aids and services that you can consider. The one that we'll focus most on today is number 2, instructional. But you can also consider ways to provide aids and services in the realms of collaborative, physical, and social behavioral. Next consideration is that of adaptation. How can we adapt the curriculum to make it more accessible for students with significant needs? When we think about adapting curriculum, that's really where we look at applying the principles of universal design for learning to the curriculum that's available for students. And just as a brief refresher, those 3 principles are engagement, representation, and action and expression. So looking at how the student engages in the curriculum and in the instruction that's going on around them, how the content itself is represented to the student, and then how the student, via action and expression, is able to give back to the teacher what it is that they've learned and what they know. Toying with those different areas and tinkering with the different strategies that you use in each of those 3 principles is one way, the main way, that you work on adapting curriculum. So let's look in a little more detail here. For instance, if we're looking at representation and thinking of ways to adapt a curriculum based on how it's represented to the student, you may do things such as changing the font size, using graphics or adding graphics, or even using technology or electronic text. That's a way to modify or adapt the curriculum that's already used in the gen ed setting. Looking at action and expression, changing the way that students are conveying their understanding of the content. Of course, we could use all sorts of technological things like multimedia presentations with videos or PowerPoint, thinking about ways that students could perform a performance-based experience or project that they can demonstrate their learning that way, or some sort of artistic drawing, painting, something like that, product in that way. It's really a great place to think outside the box as far as how can we play on our students' strengths and allow them to indicate the content that they know. And lastly, thinking about how we can work on different ways to keep a student engaged in the content. Providing choice is the biggest one of those. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. I wanted to specifically point out here a way to think about adapting methods of representation. So if there's ever written text involved in the general curriculum, I want you to think about going through these steps. If there's written text, how can we adapt that or sort of add to it to also include a verbal presentation of that information? Many students aren't able to read the written text. It's not accessible to them in that format. So we're going to look at presenting it verbally, either by a teacher or a peer reading it out loud, or having some kind of recording of that written text that the student is able to access and play the recording for themselves. Even then, if you're thinking about the general curriculum being presented verbally, maybe a teacher giving a short lecture or presentation, maybe listening to a story on tape, something like that, we can further adapt that method of presentation by including visual supports. So thinking about including videos or graphics and even photographs to make it a more connected experience for the student. So thinking through that flow of anything that's written can be augmented or adapted, enhanced by making it verbal, and then anything that's verbal can be further enhanced by making it visual. And thinking through that whole span of ways to make the curriculum and the content more accessible for students, I think is a good, it's kind of a go-to strategy to think about how can I make this accessible for students. That was adaptation in a nutshell. Now let's talk about augmentation. Don't get hung up on the words adaptation and augmentation. This is what's found in the literature and the definitions, but really these are just strategies that we want to be using for our students. So as far as curriculum augmentation goes, what we're really talking about there is enhancing the curriculum that's already available to students in the gen ed setting by incorporating what we'll call learning to learn strategies. So not only are we presenting the general curriculum, but we're also going to include some instruction and strategies that help students learn to learn. This chart shows you just a few examples in a couple of different domains. So one way that a student can be learning to learn is by working on some rehearsal strategies, either by shadowing or by taking verbatim notes. You can see the details there. And now we've reached the bottom of that flow chart. Only after we have considered all the above things, the supplementary aids and services, the adaptations to curriculum, and the augmentation to curriculum, then we'll look at perhaps potentially using an alternate curriculum. The access mandate for students with significant needs, really for students with any disability, is that students participate in the general curriculum. So it's super important that we try all of these things first before we go off path to looking at an alternate curriculum. Similarly, thinking about strategies for differentiation. So that's another way of incorporating or thinking about instructional strategies. You're going to be instructing anyway, but now how can I differentiate it to make it meaningful and purposeful for particular students and align with their specific needs? There's a whole list here of different strategies that may or may not sound familiar to you. They're great for all students, regardless of their level of disability. But one I think that is important to point out is increasing the engagement of students through student response techniques. And those could be a variety of things. Could be response cards, either yes, no, or choice A, choice B, that students are able to hold up to indicate their choice, gets a little movement going in the lesson. Or it could be even something as simple as a thumbs up, thumbs down. We see those kinds of response techniques a lot in the general education setting, and they're perfectly appropriate to be in the self-contained setting as well, to get students engaged in responding to the instruction that's going on around them. The other one I want to point out is that last one about making adjustments to sensory characteristics within the environment. So many of our students with significant needs have specific sensory needs or sensitivities that can really create quite a barrier to them being able to engage in their instruction and in their education. So if you can think about modifying things like the lighting, or if there's glare coming in from a particular window or a particular light, if there's a way to modify a noise level at all of those things can really make a big impact on students and sort of remove some barriers that you may not even realize are there in the first place. Let's look now at some strategies for literacy. Before we get into the specific strategies, I want to look over a few general notes on literacy for students with significant needs. First, it's important to know that there's no single approach, either whole language or pure phonics, that will work for students with significant needs, primarily because students with disabilities, but especially students with significant disabilities, have been found to be engaged in reading aloud, having been read aloud to, having access to written materials, the ability to draw, all of these kinds of expressive things. They have had less access to that throughout their lives. And so there isn't one way or the other that's going to target what they need. We need to immerse them in all things. So we're going to immerse them in being read to, having access to writing and drawing materials, and really just having some free write or free draw time. And lastly, having that access to technology is so important because those are things that are lacking for our students with significant needs. We are definitely going to increase our expectations by exposing students to the typical reading program, the general education reading program. First and foremost, we'll look at adapting materials. One way that's a great way to make adapted materials for students is to look at making tactile books. There's a whole just wealth of information out there about how to make tactile books. It's not as simple as you might think about put something on the page that they can touch and then that's it. There's really this sort of theory about what does it need to be. It should be something that truly feels like the item or object that's being discussed in the book. It doesn't necessarily have to look like it, but it has to feel like it. We can talk more about that in future webinars, I suppose, but really I would recommend that as something to look into further for your students who are really looking for a way to engage in the literacy materials around them. And of course, assistive technology is always a way to circumvent some barriers that some of our students have. Following the interest of students, this is applicable for students with disabilities and their non-disabled peers alike. When students are interested in what they're learning, they're going to be more engaged. And so if you can adapt any of the literacy materials that a student is engaging in to follow their interests and make sure that they have meaning, that will increase outcomes for those students. Offering choices, that's a big one. And there are so many things we can offer choices to students while still maintaining relative control over what's going on in the lesson. So if you know that there's a particular subject area that you want the student to be reading about or engaging in content about, give them 2 topics from within that subject area and allow them to choose which topic they're going to read about. Let them choose what place they're reading or writing in, whether they're sitting at a desk, on the floor, in a beanbag chair, etc. How long does the student want to read? Now, we have to give them some pretty firm options, right? Not, do you want to do it for 1 minute or 30 minutes, because they will choose 1 minute and call it a day. But you can give them both options that you would be fine with. Do you want to write for 3 minutes or 5 minutes? That provides an element of choice to them. Let them choose the writing implement or the writing material. So whether they're using a pencil, chalk, a marker to write with, or whether they're writing on a dry erase board, colored paper, a magnet board even. All of these things, you know, at the end of the day, they're going to be generating some content, right? They're going to be putting some writing out there. And so how they're doing it really is not the point at this time. And if we're able to give them choice, then let's do it. And then lastly on this slide, creating meaningful literacy opportunities, which we sort of already addressed, but these specific ways to do that, including signing a name with a signature stamp, that is sort of a very step 1 way that a student can engage in literacy. Their name is the very first thing, you know, text-wise or whatever, that is most important to them. And so if they can put their name on something on their paper or sign a document with a signature stamp, that's a way that they've engaged in literacy at the very most basic level. And there's a couple other ways on here as well. Here's more tactile books. So this I found was a great way to incorporate both the idea of a tactile book. So that cat has some fur on it, right, that the student can feel. It can feel the whiskers and they're kind of crinkly coming out. But we're also pairing those tactile things with a photograph to make the connection for students. So at some point we'll want to get further away from the tactile piece and more toward that idea of having photographs, and then we can lead that into symbols and then into words, right? There's a whole progression that we follow in that way. But this just gives you some more details on how you might turn a book into a tactile book. Okay, let's look now at some specific reading strategies. So when you're thinking about introducing a story that you'll be reading with your class or with your students, one of the best ways that you can immediately engage students is by introducing it through some additional sensory input. There are a couple of examples here. So if you're going to be reading The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, you might turn on a fan so that students can literally feel a breeze and make that connection to there's wind happening in this story, right? Or for something like Johnny Appleseed, have an apple where students are taking a bite out of a slice of an apple so that they can connect to a real life experience that is part of what's going on in that book. That will get their hooks in on what's being read and hopefully continue that train of engagement throughout. Once you've started now and you're wanting students to participate in reading the story, there are several different ways that you can sort of approach that. Again, you might look at modifying the book either with a tactile book, or you can use laminated symbols that can be affixed and added or taken away as the student or as someone else is reading the book. The student can engage by putting a symbol on that matches what's going on or taking it off as that is done. A student can play a segment of recorded text, so whether it's pre-recorded by a teacher or a peer or even the student themselves, if they're reading along with the class and it's their turn, they can use a switch or some other kind of device to start playing their segment of the recorded text, and that's getting them participating in reading the story. Of course, we all know about high interest and low vocabulary versions of texts. There are several websites out there if you just Google high interest, low vocabulary versions, but even at the high school level, even at upper grade levels, when the texts are a little more complicated, you can find versions that are high interest, low vocabulary that can make even that kind of reading more accessible for our students. And then lastly, I found this to be an interesting one. Make books easier to manipulate by either rebinding, so taking the pages out and maybe laminating and putting in a binder so that students are more easily able to manipulate the pages, or using page fluffers, which I thought was so interesting, but I love the idea, so I included way down at the bottom a link there for 5 ways to make page fluffers. And it literally makes the pages easier for a student to turn. If you can't turn the pages, why do you care about what's being read, right? So I think that's a great strategy to check out as far as participating in reading the story. Next, we'll think about assessing sort of what's going on and then teaching comprehension, right? So being able to assess what and how much a student is comprehending. A few strategies listed here. One is repeated storyline responding. So we all know there are those books that have a particular line that's repeated throughout the book. Students can pick up on that pattern fairly quickly, and when they do, that's one way to show that they're engaged and sort of paying attention to what's going on and that they can predict what's going to be happening next by participating in that repeated storyline. Interactive language charts and then thinking maps as well. There are all sorts of thinking maps, but if you specifically think about students, maybe you're wanting to work on characteristics of a character or something like that in a story, bubble maps are great for that, and if you just Google bubble maps, you'll find all sorts of examples. Or flow maps. Flow maps are great for showing the sequence of a story, what happened first, what happened next, and so forth. So really the whole idea of the thinking maps is that it helps visually show students the relationships between the characters in the story, the concepts that are being discussed in the story, and then events that are going on. Guided group practice is another specific reading strategy. The example I put here is specifically for learning sight words in a small group setting, and there's a very specific set of steps that you can go through that have been sort of proven via research to be a very effective way for students to learn sight words. I won't read all those steps to you there, but you can see that and sort of keep that in mind as a strategy you might try in the future. Independent practice. So often I think this is one strategy that gets left behind when we're thinking about our students for significant needs. There are so many things that they do require support with that it's difficult to imagine they need to also be independently practicing some of these skills. So these are just a couple of ways that students can be practicing independently with their reading skills. Just looking at books, again, being engaged and taking in what they see is a great way to stay engaged, but it's also independent, right? And we want these books to be related to the content that's being studied at that time. Being able to produce an art project that's related to that story, that's something oftentimes that a student can do more independently if they have some guidelines ahead of time. Keeping it related to the story, then they can sort of think through their own understanding of what that story was about and put it out in an art format. And then even just matching pictures and words and pictures from a story that they've been reading or the content that's being studied, if they can match pictures and words, even that is keeping their wheels turning, right, about the content that's been discussed. We always want to make sure that the books and the materials that students are using are age appropriate. So when you're thinking about students at a higher grade level, I wanted to point out just a few examples here that even older students can engage in picture books with age-appropriate themes, because of course the pictures themselves are engaging, but we want to make sure those themes, the content, is still age and grade appropriate. So there's just a couple examples here of various kinds of readings: folk stories, current issues, and historical events. But again, that's something that if you know what to search for, if you know what to Google for, you can find some picture books out there that have minimal text, really engaging pictures, and really on-topic themes for older students. Now let's look at some specific strategies for written expression. This book, More Language Arts, Math and Science for Students with Severe Disabilities, is sort of the companion book to the book that I mentioned earlier in this webinar, and this is where these ideas for specific written expression strategies come from. First and foremost, we want to make sure that the writing is meaningful. Again, as with anything, the more meaningful it is for a student, the more they're going to be engaged in it, and the longer they're likely to spend with that material. We'll talk more here in a bit, but in general, encouraging imitation, so either by copying words or sentences, something like that, or even just repeating words at that point if a student is unable to do it physically, writing. That idea of imitation is sort of a first step, a first strategy in generating content for a student. Teaching spelling skills is actually quite a good way for students to be able to begin their written expression. It doesn't have to be spelling perfectly, right? But especially getting the idea of letters matching particular sounds, especially for those key initial sounds. We can use inventive spelling, to get our point across. So, and not necessarily for every student, but the idea of teaching spelling skills is important. Next is encouraging sentence construction. So you may notice that this is sort of following a path of the very most beginning basic stages of these strategies all the way to getting a little bit more complicated and diverse. So once students have a little bit of that spelling skill, they can use, again, that inventive spelling, and we're going to encourage them to construct some sentences with it. Whether we understand what the sentence says or not is not really the point when we're thinking about written expression. We're just wanting the student themselves to participate in that generation of content. Once they are more able to construct some sentences, then we'll teach sort of the specific structures around narrative writing. Why are we choosing narrative? Because that's about the student themselves, right? And so that's what's going to be most relevant and most salient to them. So we'll teach what does it look like to write a short narrative. And then lastly, and sort of most complex in this whole line of strategies, is to look at providing editing and revision instruction as well. And that just sort of moves through the whole flow of what written expression is. Ways to make writing meaningful. Wanted to point these out. So first and foremost, being able to write their name is a super way to make sure that writing is meaningful for a student. And again, whether that's writing it physically with a writing implement, or whether a student has a signature stamp, whether it's just that they write the first letter of their name, and that indicates their name. That's super meaningful and super important for students to develop that. I like the idea of thinking about developing a signature for students. That's one way that they will have some independence after they leave us in school. There's all sorts of things that people have to sign. And any kind of distinctive mark that they make, think about doctors, right? You don't have to understand or be able to read the actual name. Any kind of distinctive mark that a student can make that indicates their signature can be considered their signature. So that's really a meaningful way, I think, to work with a student on their writing. Indicating, of course, their personal information, so maybe address, phone number, potentially their parents' or guardians' names, things like that that could be important in a situation with a doctor's appointment or needing to speak to an emergency person or something like that. Somehow being able to indicate their personal information, pretty important. So that's going to be meaningful to a student if you work on writing that way. Composing letters or emails, that's a primary way, emails especially, that communication takes place these days. So working on sort of the basic structure of an email and what does that look like, that's going to be meaningful to a student. Maybe setting up some pen pals via email with the class next door or a school across the country, who knows. But that is much more engaging, I think, to then be working on writing and be excited to hear what's going to come back from your email that you send. Completing job applications, again, goes to that independence piece, so working on writing in that way. And then creating journals. I think this is an idea that doesn't necessarily get as much attention as some of those other ideas. Most of those other ones are quite functional, which is super important. But creating a journal and allowing a student to have some kind of way to express their thoughts or just remember what's going on around them, noting specific events that are important to them, that's going to make their writing super meaningful. So anytime a student has the opportunity to participate in some kind of journaling exercise or the creation of a journal is a really personal and powerful way to get students working on their writing. And this will be continued. We didn't touch math, we didn't touch science, and there's so much more we could have talked about even with the literacy. So stay tuned. Project Success will be putting even more resources out there. We know that this is something that we get probably the most questions about. Like, this is all well and good, having high expectations for students. I understand the content connectors now, but what do I do with them? How do I use those in my instruction? So this was just our first attempt to get you some strategies out there. But stay tuned. We want to make sure that we're supporting you with additional strategies in the future. If you have any questions for us, you can contact us via email, and you can also visit our website as well. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great day.